Anyway, I want to talk a little bit today. Again, we're on that. I'm on that theme of encounters with the resurrected Jesus, and I want to look today at the story of Thomas, the doubting. We call him Doubting Thomas. That's his nickname because he doubted, right? He will have been a Mennonite because any Mennonite ever says something or does something is a little bit off. Now that's his nickname. Yeah, right? And so that's kind of like Doubting Thomas. But anyway, I have entitled my message, Proof of the Resurrection of Jesus, but I was actually going to entitle it, Seeing is Believing. And I had it written down, I had it on there and everything, and then all of a sudden I began to think, well, seeing is not necessarily believing, right? You know what Jesus said to Thomas, you believe because you're seeing? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. So seeing may not be believing. And then I began to think about it further, and I said, well, the Pharisees, they saw. Nicodemus said that we know that you're from God, but they chose not to believe, right? The Pharisees didn't believe. Pilate saw, but he didn't believe. Jesus knew that they would not believe and they would crucify him. Right? And so seeing is not believing, so I entitled Proof of the Resurrection of Jesus. If you're open to receive it, then that proof is there. So one of the things, so when it comes to believing, there's many people that don't believe because they don't believe that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. So I want to just look at that a little bit. Like, first of all, some argue that he never was dead, that he was actually just in a coma, and when he was in the coolness of the tomb and so on, he woke up and he walked out. Okay? So to have a resurrection, you have to have a body, right? You have to have a dead body, right? That's just common sense. You know, you're going to have a resurrection, you have to have a dead person. So we know that Joseph of Arimathea asked for the body of Jesus when he was still on the cross. He had died. They knew he was dead. The Roman soldiers had done their tests, their absolute proof tests that he was dead. Joseph took the body down, and in John chapter 19 we read that Nicodemus, the Pharisee, also helped him to take the body down, and then he brought a lot of the stuff that he needed to bury it with, you know, with the whatever you call all that, but so it wouldn't smell bad, and you know, so that when they came to treat him and so on, he would the myrrh and aloes stuff, and you know, they would wrap him with that so that he would not smell bad. And it says in the Bible that Nicodemus brought about 100 pounds of that. That's a lot of aromatic herbs and so on. But anyway, they took the body down from the cross, and you can just imagine. I don't know if I have never dealt with a dead body, okay, like physically. I know that some of you people might have that experience. In Mexico, I remember when my aunt died, she ended up in one of our classrooms in our school on a table under ice. And the ladies would wash her and get her ready to be buried and stuff like that. So some people handle that. And now if people do that more often, surely you know whether the body is dead or not, right? Surely Joseph and Nicodemus would have noticed if Jesus wasn't dead. One of the arguments is, well, he woke up and he just broke out of the tomb and came out. The Romans, they had beaten him so horrendously bad, and then he was stabbed with a spear right into his vitals, and and now he woke up and he was strong enough after the nails in his hands and in his feet and hanging there and so on. He was strong enough to remove that stone that a number of men, it took numerous men to roll that stone into place. It was that big and heavy. And now here, this almost dead Jesus was able to move the stone? No. I mean, not physically possible, right? So there's those kind of evidences that we can talk about. But one of the interesting things to me is that the Pharisees and the Romans never argued that Jesus didn't die. They knew he was dead. They never argued that he didn't die, that he rose up or, No. They knew he was dead. So they didn't argue his death. And the Romans, they were masters at killing. They knew when they had killed somebody. I mean, they were masters at that. And so, and the other thing is, ancient people in those days, they were not isolated from death like we are. Like we just are very isolated from the horrendous consequences of huge accidents. We're not even allowed close to the scene most of the time until it's all cleaned up and made presentable. But it wasn't that way in Bible times. Like when Jesus was beaten and so on, everybody was right there. They saw the whole thing. When he died on the cross, they were right there. They watched the whole thing. And when when they tested whether he was still alive, like the Roman soldier, they were right there. Like it was all very raw and real. So there's no hiding anything and thinking, oh, well, maybe he wasn't dead. No, they knew death when they saw death. They had all that experience, right? So there was a corpse. There was a dead person. To have a resurrection, you have to have a corpse, and they did. And then the proof of the resurrection is largely in the eyewitnesses of Jesus, right? I don't know, you know the book, A Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. We did that in Sunday school a few years ago, Lee Strobel was a Chicago Tribune investigative reporter, and his wife became a Christian. He hated it, so he decided to prove that to be all false. And in the end, he comes to believe in Jesus because he went to the fullest extent of all the research and the historical research and everything to find in trying to prove Jesus false. And it was just the opposite. It proved him right, real. And he finally comes to know Jesus through that. There's another book that I got to know back in the 1980s. It was called Who Moved the Stone? Same story, different person. I'm trying to remember his... here I have it. Frank Morrison. Same thing. He really did not believe in the resurrection, and he went out to prove that it never happened, that's us all fake, that Jesus is just a made-up story. And in the end, when he came to more and more and more evidence and facts that couldn't be denied, he just decided to believe the facts, the truth, and he came to know Jesus. So, Who Moved a Stone? I would really encourage you, if you have never read one of those books, Who Moved a Stone or A Case for Christ, look it up. It's worth reading, and just to think through yourself, why do we really believe in Jesus, and why do we still believe in him now 2,000 years later? And how can we know that he really was real and that he died and he rose again from the dead? And when these hardened non-believers do the research and they come to believe, there is something there that most Christians could never explain because we've never studied it. We believe it. And that's okay. Believing without seeing is what Jesus actually praised. And so, this Frank Morrison, he came to that place where he just could not help but all of a sudden he was just overwhelmed with this, I believe. And he came to that point of faith. It was a very real experience for him in that process of researching Jesus. So in the Bible, we have these witnesses too. Like Mary was the first one. I did that message a little while ago on Mary, who was the very first one to show up at the tomb. And she finds it empty. What she does is she runs back to the disciples, tells the disciples Peter and John, they decide, oh, wow, really? And they get up and they run, they race to the tomb, and they see it empty. They go home. But Mary goes back to the tomb, and Jesus then reveals himself to her. He talks to her. First she sees the two angels, and I preached on all that. You can look that up. But the fact is that she met Jesus, the resurrected Jesus. But even then, the disciples didn't believe. So Jesus shows up with the disciples. In John chapter 20, verse 19 to 22, then the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood in their midst and said to them, "Peace be with you." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. So Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so send I you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sin of any, they are retained." So there's an emotional progression for the disciples. At first, they are really afraid when Jesus showed up. Right? They were afraid and they wondered, what is this all about? And then when Jesus showed them his side and everything, then they were glad. They became excited about this. But then the Bible tells us very clearly that Thomas was not present. One of the disciples wasn't there. And today I just want to talk a little bit about Thomas and how he responded. He wasn't there when Jesus showed himself, so he hadn't seen it. And I have always thought of Thomas as that he chose not to believe. Right? Like the Pharisees, they chose not to believe. They chose not to. The disciples, they told Thomas about it. Hey, Jesus was here in our midst, and he wouldn't believe it. He said, unless I see the scars in his hands and the wound in his side, I will not believe. He chose not to believe. But the more I have looked at it and the more I've thought about it, I think maybe Thomas's attitude was this: he is risen? That's just too good to be true. I saw him die. I will not allow myself to hope that he's back alive again until I can be sure my hope will not be dashed again. The more I thought about Thomas, the more I began to think about it like he was one of the disciples. He loved Jesus, he walked with Jesus, he saw all the miracles, he believed in Jesus. But just like the rest of the disciples, when he died on the cross and he was buried, they all thought, this is it, it's over. None of them believed that he was going to be raised from the dead and come back to life, right? Including Thomas. The other ones now only decided to believe because they saw Jesus, but Thomas didn't see him. And I am suspecting that he was not willing to trust their testimony because the phenomenal disappointment and pain of losing their master and their close friend and teacher, he was afraid that he would be disappointed again. Don't we often go through difficult circumstances and we pray and we ask God to help us to resolve the issue, and when he doesn't, we get disappointed in God, and then we are afraid to pray again for something else because what if he disappoints me again? Ever been there? I've been there. I don't know, like he didn't help me last time that I really needed help, and I thought, and I prayed, and at least he didn't answer the way I wanted him to answer, right, that I thought he would, and so I get very disappointed, and so sometimes we give up and we don't pray anymore because we don't trust the way God will answer. Get that? I really believe that's where Thomas was. I don't think that he didn't want to believe in Jesus, that he decided, no, I don't want to have anything to do with that shenanigan. That wasn't it. But the disciples, they were all so broken, they were all so disappointed, they were all so, well, just in great pain of losing their master, they couldn't believe that he could rise from the dead. They didn't believe. He had told them, but they didn't believe it. And when he died, they just completely gave up. And Thomas did as well. And now they're saying they've seen him, but I haven't seen him. What if that is not true? Maybe he thought, what if they just had a vision? If I now buy into what they're saying wholeheartedly and I let my hopes be raised, what if they just get dashed again? And I am in my own thinking, I'm beginning to think of Thomas as not so much the one that chose not to believe, as more so he didn't dare to risk the chance of being wrong, of the disciples being wrong, because of the pain that would cause, to be disappointed again. And I began to see myself so clearly in many ways. I tend to, if I get hurt deeply once, I tend to be afraid to trust again. And I'm not talking now so much about necessarily trusting God, but trusting friends, trusting somebody, even one of your family members. If you have a good relation with somebody and one day that person hurts you very, very deeply, it becomes very, very difficult to trust them again, doesn't it? Because we're afraid, what if they betray me again? Anybody been there? Finding it hard to trust somebody else because they betrayed me once. And then we believe this little saying that says, fool me once, that's on me, but no, that's on you, but fool me twice, that's then on me, right? Then to trust them. Basically that's saying, don't ever trust somebody that betrays you the first time. Don't ever trust them again. And Nicodemus and all the disciples were extremely disappointed, and I think they felt abandoned by Jesus. They felt, this didn't pan out. Jesus isn't who we thought he was. He's now dead. And they were extremely disappointed, and Thomas wasn't about to trust it again until it was proven. Right? That's where I see myself often. And so then all of a sudden, they come back together and Jesus shows up. 8 days later, they're together, and then all of a sudden, Jesus shows up. And Thomas, Jesus says to Thomas, Jesus greets them the same way he did the first time 8 days before that, and then he says to Thomas, okay, Thomas, come here. Look at my hands. Put your fingers here. Put your hand here. And Thomas just can't help but to bow and says, my Lord and my King. I can't imagine how he must have felt when he met Jesus and he decided to trust again. He could trust again. I have often struggled in my faith in God, praying for things, will God answer? And learning over the years that maybe not so much pray very specifically, God, I need this, or would you do this? Or very specific prayers, more, God, help me to understand the situation your way and help me to see what you want me to do in the situation. But I think there are times when we struggle in our faith that it's okay to maybe ask God to show himself. God, would you please just do something here? So years ago, I came across a story. As a matter of fact, many years ago. Many of you won't have even been alive back then. This was in 1985, 86. We had a speaker at a youth retreat in Aylmer, Ontario, who brought along a story on cassette from Prairie Bible Institute, Bible school in Alberta, Canada. They had a missionary from Colombia, South America, there at their mission fest, a week-long mission event. And they had this Russell Stendhal from who was a missionary. Him and his brother, his family, they were missionaries in Colombia, South America. And so Russell then invited him to come and tell some stories and to share about the missions that they were doing in Colombia. So here's one of the stories that Russell Stendhal told at that time. And so I Googled him, Russell Stendhal, and there it is. So I listened to it this week over again on video, they had it on video, and back from 1985. If you want to know what kind of haircut I had and what kind of hair I had in 1985, Google Russell Stendhal 1985 at that mission fest. That was my hairstyle. Pretty well exactly. And I'm thinking, back then I never saw him. I just heard the audio version. Anyway, here's the story about believing in God and choosing to believe when God shows up. Like doubting Thomas, Jesus showed up. Russell Stendhal and his family were, like I said, they were missionaries in Colombia. And in Colombia, there's the anti-government guerrillas, big time at work, trying to destroy the government. And they're always fighting against the government. And so they kidnap people and use them for their means. And anyway, so Russell Stendhal and his brother started an aviation ministry, flying for missionaries, because sometimes they're so far in the jungle, it's way too far to walk or to drive, there's no roads, and so they did a lot of flying. But a lot of the missionaries didn't have money to pay them, so they had to have other ways of earning money so they could afford to fly for the missionaries. So one of the things that Russell Stendhal did is he would fly into different areas, and they would buy up the fish of local fishermen at a decent price for them to make a good living. But then they would take them to market in the city, and so they would buy up all these fish from these fishermen. One of the fishermen he would fly into to buy fish from was by a huge lava flow, where a river at the top came over this lava flow, came quite a high waterfalls, and then the river continued along the bottom, right? So there's this waterfalls, and this water would hit the bottom in such a way that there's this big geyser of water always shooting up into the air, right? And it would come over this water, this lava flow in two streams. So anyway, he flies in and in the evening, has supper with his fishermen, and then he would leave in the morning, load up the fish and leave in the morning. And the fisherman had his traps set up in the river on top of the lava flow. And all he had to do was, once or twice a day, go and empty the traps and take the fish. And he didn't have to work. He just takes the fish, and and that's how this fisherman would make his living. Anyway, so he flies in there. Russell Stendhal, one evening, towards evening, he flies in there, and he meets one of these professors from the anti-government guerrillas with a group of about 10 teenage boys. They've come down the river in a big dugout canoe with a motor, and they're studying the water flow. He finds out later that this was an anti-government guerrilla recruiting young men to train into their work, right? But anyway, they had come there, so they were there with his fishermen, and so Russell Stendhal and this communist professor, they get into this classic argument about whether there is really a God, whether God exists. And they argue back and forth, and they argue and argue and argue, and the fisherman gets sick of it, and he finally says, "Look, you guys, you're both right, just shut up and let's eat, and let's, just quit the arguing." So Russell Stendhal says to this professor, the final thing he says, we can settle this argument very, very easily. He says, you, the professor, if you will just authorize God to prove himself to you, then he will do it. If you're willing to authorize God to prove himself to you, he will prove himself to you. And this professor stands up and it says, all right, I authorize God, if he exists, to prove himself to me if he can. But in the meantime, I choose not to believe in God. I choose communism. And so they eat supper, go to bed. Next morning, Russell loads up his fish and takes off and leaves. He comes back 2 days later, and the fisherman is waiting at the airstrip, the little airstrip that they have there, waiting for him, all excited. And he's wondering, something's gone wrong. Like there must be an emergency. And as soon as he's out of his plane, this Indian says to him, "Hey, you wouldn't believe what happened to the professor." Oh, well, what happened to the professor? Well, so he tells the story how the last time he was there, in the morning, they're going to go and empty the traps, and the professor and his students are going to watch, and they're going to learn about, about the lava flow and all that. So what the fisherman does, he empties the traps on this side of the river, and then he goes upriver a little ways, and then he crosses the river, and then he comes back along the river, back towards the falls, and then he empties the traps that he has there. Just in case there's a problem with the boat, right? So you don't go over the waterfalls. The fisherman had seen six or eight individuals go over that falls over the years, and every single one of them was always killed. None of them survived. So they go across the river. The professor with his kids, they follow. They go to the other side, and then when they're going to come back, fisherman goes upriver. The professor decides to just go straight across the river, right in front of the falls. Halfway across, the motor dies. And the professor and the boys, they all go over the falls, all 11 of them. This fisherman, man, he races back across the river, and then he runs down to the bottom of the falls. He has an old boat there, and he says it was even a miracle that the motor would start. But he started up the motor and starts picking up boys in the water, and after a while, he has all 10 boys. He got them all, but there's just no sight of the professor. They look and they search and they look and so on. They look everywhere, and there's no professor. They just can't find him. He's gone. And they're about to give up and so on, and one of the boys says, "Hey, way down river, someone see that little dot there on the river? What is that?" So they decide to go down river, and here they find the dugout canoe, half full of water, with the professor sitting in the canoe with his hands on both sides, with his fingernails dug into the wood he was holding on so tight. And what happened is the boat tipped, everybody went everywhere, the professor goes down one chute, the canoe down the other, and he hit this geyser of water, and it threw him up into the air and landed him right in the canoe. And he got a hold of the side. Okay, and so then the fisherman said, the last words of the professor before they left said, "Tell Russell, I believe in God." God proved himself to him. I wouldn't recommend necessarily just to test God, say, "God, prove yourself to me." But if any one of you is here today is that you've really just struggled with faith in God and that you don't believe, I would encourage you, go ahead. Ask God to prove himself to you. Authorize him to prove himself to you. But then be open that when he does, it may not at all look like what you think it should look like. Because God has his own ways, right? But if you believe, please don't put him to the test. It might not go very well. It could get very rough. But anyway, doubting Thomas, I believe that the reason why he struggled with believing is because he had all his hopes in Christ, and then all of a sudden it's all dashed. He was extremely disappointed, maybe deeply wounded, maybe deeply hurt, and I believe he was afraid to trust, or to trust the disciples to believe without actually seeing. But when he met Jesus, then he believed. So I want to just encourage you, if you're struggling with faith today in Jesus Christ, or if you're disappointed in God, I would really encourage you to spend time talking to God, talking to Jesus, and just ask him to somehow deal with your doubts. Break your doubts. Let's all stand. Father, I just pray right now that if there's someone here today that maybe has a broken heart with whatever, may have lost a loved one or in some way felt a lot of pain and a great loss and struggle with faith in you, I pray that you would step into that situation and bring healing, bring understanding, bring your grace to believe again. I just pray for each and every one of us that's here today that, Lord, wherever we are in our faith, but you know exactly what we need, what you want to do. Would you have your way with us? I thank you for what you will do, and so may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God just overwhelm you and just make it so certain in your heart and your mind that, yes, I believe in God. I believe that Jesus died for me. I believe that he rose from the dead. I will one day be with him in eternity. May that be our assurance. May that be our deepest, greatest faith. Peace. Thank you. Amen.